I want to give a brief introduction to Bill, who's sitting here beside me. Bill lives in Washington, D.C. He's been active in the workplace and the community struggles for most of his life. He serves as a senior staff person in the American Federation of Labor, and he is the author of a number of books. So without further ado, Bill, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm here mainly to talk about the issue of education, social justice, and democracy, and the relationship to unionism. But I was thinking before getting into that about an incident that happened when I first got to the American Federation of Labor, or AFL-CIO. And I was introduced to several representatives of the American Federation of Teachers, which is the second largest teachers union in the United States. So I was the education director, which was the position focused on internal education within the union movement, not education policy. But anyway, so I was talking to them, and they were telling me about the attacks. This was in 1996, maybe early 97. They were telling me about the attacks on education, public. And I said to them something like this: that's why we're going to have to defend the public sector. And they looked at me as if I had just started speaking Amharic. And then they said, education is being attacked. I said, that's right. That's why we have to defend the public sector. And they looked at me again as if now I was not only speaking Amharic, maybe a little bit of Mongolian. And they said, no, education is being attacked. And I said, that's right. That is why we have to defend the public sector. You're not going to be able to defend public education when the rest of the public sector is being destroyed. And that one of the biggest challenges in the United States, at least, was that you had public education being defended by public sector, by unions, teachers' unions, in the absence of a larger context about what was happening to the public sector as a whole. So it became almost a sort of moralistic battle. You know, yes, we need to defend public education. Well, yeah, of course we do. But how can you have this island, public education, when the sea is encroaching on it and encroaching on other parts of the public sector? And I would argue that to a great extent, one of the reasons that the public sector, the teachers unions in the United States have been on the defensive for quite some time is that they've missed that linkage. They have seen public education in the absence of what's happening in the rest of the public sector. And that was used very, very well by Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who was basically able to make teachers and other parts of the public sector, but particularly teachers, enemy number one. Greedy, out for themselves, special interest, etc. He was able to develop, as I talked about last night, an anti-worker front, but with a particular focus on the issue of public education and teachers. So I wanted to start there. But I think it's important when we're looking at the issue of public education to recognize that this is really a fight since the 19th century, a fight to have real public education, and that the trade union movement has historically played a very, very important role in that battle. The fight for public education was a fight actually that corresponded to a demand to expand democracy. It was an anti-elitist fight that was undertaken. And it was not undertaken simply by unions. In the US, one of the interesting and very almost unknown features of the period of Reconstruction right after our Civil War was that there was a fight around public education that was led by black women, former slaves, who embarked on a major campaign in the Reconstruction South to establish and expand public education for what were called the freedmen, the term for the ex-slaves. So that fight was understood not simply as a fight around getting people education in order to get better jobs, but it was seen as a front in the battle for democracy, that you could not have a real democracy if you didn't have a fully functioning public education system. And so in addition to the fights being waged by the ex-slaves, you ultimately had the role of trade unions in advancing that battle. Now, for much of the 20th century, the battle for public education coincided with the needs of capital. Capital largely needed a more educated workforce given the nature of the economy. So there was this overlap between the demands for the expansion of public education advanced by social movements, progressive social movements, and at the same time, this interest by at least a major segment of capital for public education in order to train and in some cases discipline a workforce, a fully functioning workforce for a largely manufacturing economy. And it's very interesting to watch how that's evolved. And I don't know enough about Canada to speak about your situation, but what I can say in the United States is in watching what happened in public education, you had at one point in the K through 12 system, and specifically when you got to high school, you had this mix of orientation towards college, orientation towards what was called business, which was more, we don't really know what to do with you, but you have to go to school, right? And then there was technical education. And the technical education by the time I was growing up in the 1960s, had started to become, in most cases, a dumping ground, but it hadn't started there. There was actually technical education to train skilled workers to move into manufacturing. But as the economy starts to change, as well as transformation of the cities and a certain kind of racialization that takes place in the cities, the whole nature of public education itself began to change. So we start to see that in 1960s, 1970s. It becomes even more substantial in terms of changes with different needs by capital. And this is something that many people don't actually want to grapple with, which is that with the rise of neoliberal globalization, the change at a global level in the way that capitalism operates, there are not the same kinds of needs for the workforce that was the case in, let's say, 1940. Now, there are, in my opinion, genocidal implications to this, which if we have time we can talk about. But the bottom line is that there's been the production in segments of the global north of redundant workforces, workers that are structurally eliminated, for all intents and purposes, from permanent, significant employment. Again, I don't know enough about your situation, but what I can say is that in the United States, what's happened is that entire cities have in effect become working class reservations. By reservations, I mean like land that Native Americans have put on. You have cities like East St. Louis, Illinois, or Camden, New Jersey, that have been economically devastated, but become repositories for workers that are not needed by the economy. And they are there and they are existing. There's a whole discussion in science fiction, which is another note, which is something I touched on in a piece that I wrote for Alternate a few months ago about science fiction and neoliberalism. But in science fiction, there was sort of the prediction of these kinds of zones. In fact, that's what we're starting to see in more and more of the global north. These zones or these reservations for the redundant workers. Given that situation, given capital's needs, the need for public education from their standpoint lessens. So I say that and I emphasize this because it's not simply about greed. It's not simply that they don't want to spend money because they want more money in their pockets, although that's true. It's that the needs of capital have changed, such that the need for the kind of workforce that was being produced in the 20th century simply doesn't exist. And then you add on to that the racial factor. So what's happened in many places in the States is that I mentioned before about technical education, vocational schools. You have in many of the whiter suburbs very high-tech vocational educational programs that continue to exist. But there's little that matches that in the cities or that is in areas that are targeted for communities of color. This is what we're seeing across the board. And this is why capital is not prepared or it has very little interest in the expansion of public education. So the overlap that once upon a time existed is now once again diverging. And so the fight that we're carrying out, public sector, unions, teachers' unions, etc., for the expansion of public education runs smack up against alternative interests on the part of capital. So you have fewer and fewer advocates within capital for the expansion of education because they frankly just don't feel that they need it. So there's additional paradoxes to this, and I don't know how much you're facing it here, but there are these contradictory messages that are being articulated about education and what workers need and will need. In the States, the major growth sectors in terms of jobs, actually you don't need more education. In some ways you need less. Yet people are being told that they need more education in order to get jobs. But that's not where the growth is. The growth is in low wage, lower education level employment. And so you get this issue that's being raised about, well, there's this unemployment and chronic unemployment because not enough people are getting more education, but that doesn't correspond to where the jobs are actually growing. So there are these messages that actually don't make any sense. I don't know whether that is happening in Canada and whether that is one of the messages that's coming over, but what it ends up doing is masking structural unemployment. It basically blames unemployment essentially on the victims and saying that the workers are not getting enough of education and that therefore explains their unemployment, when it has nothing really to do with that. The economy itself has changed in such dramatic ways, and entire sectors are just simply not needed, or sectors of workers who were receiving higher wage employment simply can't accept the level of the jobs that are actually being made available, and what that ends up meaning is that they leave the workforce. And in the period since the Great Recession, we've been seeing a lot of that, where the unemployment numbers are actually dropping, but not necessarily because more and more people are working, but because larger numbers of people are leaving the workforce entirely. So all of this is to say this, that when we're thinking about whether adult basic education or any kind of public education, it becomes incumbent that we reconnect it to this issue of democracy, and that recognition that there can't be real democracy without an educated citizenry, a citizenry that it's not simply that they're educated, that they're trained as in a particular skill, but educated, that they're encouraged to think, that they're encouraged to be creative, that they're encouraged to be able to critique. You can't have a democracy in the absence of that. That becomes a fundamental demand, and it seems to me, and has, that is part of the thrust of what the union movement needs to be taking up and allied social groups. So what does this end up meaning? What are some of the implications? I would identify about 5. One is that as I said in the beginning, we have to reassert the need for a public sector as being central to a civilized society. That the attacks in the public sector that we've been seeing since the 1970s, particularly since the rise of Thatcher and Reagan, are in effect attacking civilization. I mean, when you have Margaret Thatcher having said, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals and families, it is in essence really encouraging the notion of a war of all against all, whether it's the individual or whether it's families. So the idea of having civilization necessitates that there's a public sector, necessitates that there's some conception of society. A second is that we have to defend and reform the public sector. And here I would argue that most unions, certainly in the public sector, have really dropped the ball. That we are good at defending or asserting the need for, usually it's perceived as our jobs, right? So we'll assert that, but very rarely do we critique the public sector. Very rarely do we have unions that say, actually, here's our proposal for making it better. And this is essentially important because what it means is when we start to think at the level of reforming the public sector, then we actually can start thinking about allies. Who are our allies out there that have an interest in the public sector but may have significant differences with the way that the public sector itself is operating? And we in the public sector union movement deceive ourselves when we act as if all of the criticisms of the public sector are simply right-wing propaganda. That's just not the case. There are ways that the public sector, in fact, can and must be reformed if it is actually going to serve the public. A third issue, we need an alternative economic strategy that's constructed with corresponding educational needs. Now, what does this mean? It means that the union movement in much of the global north has not a clue about an alternative economic strategy. And I don't mean by that simply, I'm a Marxist, so I'm not saying just we need socialism and rah-rah and that's going to resolve it. I mean, short of that, we don't have much in the way of an alternative economic strategy, which ends up invariably meaning that the union movement, and particularly, but not just the public sector movement, is constantly on the defensive and constantly reacting to economic strategies advanced by the other side. So that in the United States, for instance, one of the chief forms of economic development for our cities are stadiums. Another is gambling, right? So gambling is one of the most regressive forms of taxation that you can imagine, and the stadiums have been proven, sports stadiums have been proven time and again not to be economically generating the kind of jobs that are needed for a city. Yet, what happens is that's what's advanced by capital and very little response by the union movement. Sometimes the building trades will simply say, well, if there's a stadium to be built, they will build it, and that's great. But no thinking about what kind of economic strategy do we need to rehabilitate our cities, and particularly to tap into the structurally unemployed and that whole crisis. We have to redefine society's economic needs. And that needs to be in conjunction with looking at the environmental crisis and the impact. What kind of economy do we need to be building in light of the environmental catastrophe that we're facing? So it's not just simply about jobs, it's about a certain kind of jobs. And that notion needs to permeate the discussions with students. It needs to permeate discussions about what kind of educational systems we have, whether it's the K through 12, whether it's adult basic education, or whatever. And finally, the unions must be seen as advocate for the public space and a redefinition of education. And this also must include how education itself is delivered. So again, returning to the notion of we have a responsibility not just to advance a defense of education, but also to offer our own critique about education. And there is frequently a reluctance to do that, at least I found in the States, for fear that somehow that's giving aid and comfort to the other side. Whereas it seems to me, and has always seemed to me, that when we're the ones that are advancing the reform agenda, we actually take the wind out of the sails of the other side. So I'm going to stop there and just open it up for discussion, which is actually my favorite part of this. Thank you.